My father kicked me out of the house after marrying my mom's sister because I reminded him too much of my mother. With nowhere else to go, I moved in with his brother. Now, years later, my dad is desperately trying to mend our relationship, but only because he and my aunt just had a baby, and the rest of the family is treating his child the same way he once treated me. It all started with my mother's breast cancer diagnosis. She had gone in for a routine checkup, never suspecting anything was wrong. But during the examination, the doctors found a lump in her breast. When she returned home with the results, she kept shaking her head, whispering that there had to be some mistake, that this couldn't be real. At the time, I was just a teenager, too young to grasp the gravity of what was happening or to understand how this disease would eventually shatter our family. Determined to believe it was a misdiagnosis, Mom sought out second and third opinions. But every doctor gave her the same devastating answer. I'll never forget coming home from school one day to find her collapsed on the living room floor, sobbing. I didn't understand why and kept asking her what was wrong, but she wouldn't, or couldn't, answer me. That night, she gathered my dad and me in the living room and finally spoke the words that would change our lives forever. She had breast cancer and would soon begin chemotherapy. My dad's reaction was chilling. It was as if someone had sucked the life out of him in an instant. His expression twisted into something unrecognizable before he went completely silent. He didn't say a single word. My mom, on the other hand, tried to be strong for us. She smiled at me, a forced but gentle reassurance that everything would be okay. She promised that she would fight, that I didn't need to worry. But I did worry. I had so many questions, yet I was too scared to ask. That night, I locked myself in my room, opened my laptop, and started researching everything I could about breast cancer. Each term I read, stages, chemotherapy, survival rates, sent me spiraling into deeper fear. The weight of it all was crushing. I wanted to help, but I was just a kid. How was I supposed to handle this? The months that followed were some of the darkest days of my life. My mother, the strongest person I had ever known, was suddenly fighting for her life every single day. And no matter how fierce her spirit was, the disease took its toll. She became weaker, frailer. She lost weight rapidly, her skin paled, and exhaustion kept her confined to bed for days on end. The chemo ravaged her body, draining her of energy and stripping away parts of her she had once taken for granted. No matter how hard she fought, cancer always seemed to be one step ahead. One of the hardest moments was the day I walked into the bathroom and saw my mother standing in front of the mirror, clippers in hand, shaving off her hair. Strands of her once beautiful golden locks were already scattered across the sink, falling away in clumps due to the chemo. Tears streamed down her face as she forced herself to finish the job. Her hands trembled as she held the razor, struggling to keep her emotions in check, but she couldn't hold back the sobs. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching her break down, completely powerless. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that would make it easier, but no words seemed right. How do you reassure someone when their very identity is being stolen by something they can't control? If you're wondering where my dad was during all of this, he had completely shut down. My father has never been someone who openly expresses his emotions. He's always been quiet, withdrawn, and reluctant to let people in. Even when faced with something as terrifying as my mom's cancer, he remained true to that nature. He was physically present, but mentally and emotionally, he was miles away. It was as if he had built an impenetrable wall around himself, refusing to let anyone see what he was feeling. Sometimes, I could sense that he was struggling in his own way, but he never spoke about it. What I do remember is how he refused to take my mom to her chemotherapy sessions or even sit with her after she shaved off all her hair. They argued constantly about his lack of support, but he would just sit at the dinner table in silence, staring blankly at his plate, or disappear into his workshop for hours after work, as if trying to escape from reality. As my mom's condition worsened, my dad drifted further away. By the time she lost her battle with cancer and passed away, it felt like we had already lost him too. Her death shattered us, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father break. He sobbed uncontrollably, as if every emotion he had buried for years was finally pouring out all at once. In that moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe we could get through this together, lean on each other, and try to heal. But that's not what happened. In fact, after that one day, everything got worse. My dad sank deeper into his grief, but instead of facing it, he drowned it in alcohol. Drinking became his escape, his way of numbing the pain he refused to acknowledge. At first, it was just a few drinks here and there, but soon, it spiraled out of control. He started missing work, disappearing for entire days, only to be found slumped in some bar, drinking himself into oblivion. I would come home from school to an empty, lifeless house that no longer felt like home. Without my mom, the warmth was gone. I missed her terribly, and on most nights, I had to scavenge for food because my dad had forgotten, again, to go grocery shopping. Bread and jam became my usual dinner, simply because it was the only thing left in the pantry. I can still remember the hollow feeling of sitting alone at the kitchen table, forcing myself to eat in the deafening silence, pretending to focus on schoolwork just to distract myself from the overwhelming loneliness. But the hardest part wasn't just being alone, it was when my dad actually did come home. More and more often, it wasn't even on his own. Strangers, random people I had never seen before, would show up at the house, practically dragging him inside because he was too drunk to stand. He would slump against them, slurring his words, barely conscious. It was humiliating and heartbreaking to see my father like that. And even when he was sober, he never spoke to me anymore. He never asked how I was, never checked if I was okay, never once acknowledged how much I was struggling too. It was as if I no longer existed to him. Some days, I would catch him avoiding my gaze altogether, like looking at me was too painful, like I was a living reminder of everything he had lost. I often wondered if he carried guilt for not being there for my mom when she needed him the most. Maybe he regretted how he had shut her out, how he had refused to be the husband she deserved. But he never spoke of it. He never spoke of anything. His silence was suffocating, and his absence, both physical and emotional, left me feeling like I had lost both my parents that year. Then, just a year and a half after my mom passed away, her sister, Maddie, entered our lives. She had just landed a job in our town and didn't have a place to stay, so she asked if she could live with us temporarily until she found her own apartment. My dad wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the idea. Back then, he was resistant to almost everything. But I was the one who convinced him. I thought having someone else in the house might help, that maybe Maddie's presence could pull us out of the suffocating grief we had been drowning in. At the very least, I was relieved to have an adult around who wasn't completely miserable like my father. At the time, I had no idea what her staying with us would lead to. If I had, I would have never suggested it. At first, I was happy Maddie was there. She was so much like my mom, warm, full of energy, and always looking for ways to bring people together. She cooked my favorite meals, something I hadn't had since my mom passed. Sitting down to a real dinner again after so long felt almost unfamiliar, like I was remembering what it was like to be part of a family. More than that, she actually talked to me. She'd ask about my school, my friends, my life, things my dad hadn't cared to ask about in a long time. She would tell me stories about her and my mom growing up together, painting a picture of the woman my mother had been before cancer changed everything. She even showed me old photos, reminding me of the laughter, the love, and the joy that had once filled our home. In a way, she made me feel closer to my mom again. It was comforting to be around someone who not only understood my pain, but also made an effort to help me through it. But as time went on, I started noticing something strange. Maddie wasn't just spending time with me. She was spending a lot of time with my dad, too. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was just trying to help, and I was grateful. My dad had been lost in his grief for so long, and Maddie seemed to be the only one who could reach him. She would urge him to cut back on drinking, telling him it was time to start living again, to be present for me, and, more importantly, for himself. And, somehow, he actually listened to her. After months of watching my dad spiral, things started to change. Suddenly, he was staying home more often instead of vanishing to the bar every night. Maddie convinced him to spend time with us, to sit down for dinner, to watch movies together. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were doing things as a family again. She even got him to be more involved with me. Sometimes, she'd nudge him to ask about my day, and to my surprise, he actually did. Other times, she would persuade him to come to my school games, something he hadn't done in ages. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true, to see my dad slowly returning to the person he used to be. I genuinely believed that Maddie moving in was the best thing that had happened to us. In fact, I was so convinced that her presence was healing my dad that I silently prayed she wouldn't find an apartment anytime soon. I would casually ask if she had started looking for a place, but deep down, I hoped the answer was no. I wanted her to stay because, for the first time in years, our house didn't feel like a graveyard of grief. For the first time in years, I had hope. I truly thought Maddie was the person who was going to fix everything. Little did I know, she would be the one to break it all apart. I couldn't understand why my dad and Maddie were acting this way. I kept hoping this was just some twisted nightmare, that I would wake up and everything would be back to normal. But it wasn't. And worse, things only escalated. In the following weeks, they stopped pretending. My dad and Maddie no longer hid their relationship. They were openly affectionate, as if expecting me to simply accept it, to move on just as quickly as they had. Watching them together made my skin crawl. The woman who had once been my mom's sister, my comfort, was now acting like she had always belonged in my mom's place. At first, Maddie slept in the guest room. But little by little, she started moving her things into my parents' bedroom, the room where my mom and dad had once shared their life, their love, their memories. Every day, it felt like my mother was being erased from our home. It started with the framed photos, portraits of my mom, her bright, warm smile that had once filled our house with light. One by one, Maddie took them down and stashed them away in storage. Then it was her favorite chair, the little trinkets she had collected over the years, the small reminders that she had once lived here, that she had once been loved. Gone. Every day, another piece of her disappeared, and with it, the home I had once known. Maddie, the person I had once found comfort in, now felt like an invader. She walked around like the house belonged to her, making changes without a second thought. Every time I protested, every time I asked her to stop, she ran to my dad. And every single time, he took her side. She would tell him how difficult I was being, how unreasonable I was, how I was making their life harder. And my dad? He believed her. He treated my grief, my pain, like they were inconveniences, as if I was the problem for not just accepting his new life. He told me I needed to let Maddie take care of me, as if she hadn't been the one slowly erasing my mother from existence. If I pushed back too much, he would raise his voice, frustrated that I was causing unnecessary problems. It felt like betrayal. The one person who should have understood me, who should have let me grieve in my own way, was shutting me out, choosing her over me. Then, one evening, everything boiled over. Maddie crossed a line I never imagined she would. She wanted me to move out of my own bedroom, the one I had grown up in all my life. She claimed she needed more space for her work and exercise. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I argued that she could use the guest room instead, but she dismissed it outright, saying it was too small for her needs. Then she hit me with something that left me completely speechless. She told me that since I'd be moving out in a few years when I turned 18 anyway, it made sense for her to have my room. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I stormed straight to my dad, desperate for him to do something, to finally take my side. I tried to explain how unfair Maddie was being, how this wasn't just about a room. It was about everything she had been doing since she moved in. But he didn't want to hear it. He brushed me off, acting like I was making a big deal out of nothing. The argument escalated quickly. I couldn't understand why he refused to stand up for me, why he always chose her over his own daughter, why he wouldn't listen. And finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. The words tore out of me before I could stop them. "Why do you hate me so much?" I yelled, my voice shaking, my entire body trembling with anger, with frustration, with heartbreak. I needed an answer. I needed to understand why my dad had been treating me this way since the day my mom died. I needed to know why he had turned his back on me. But deep down, I was terrified of what that answer might be. Without hesitation, my dad spat out the words that would haunt me forever. "Because you remind me of your mother too much. You talk like her. You look like her. I hate seeing your expressions all day." His words hit me like a physical blow. I froze. My own father had just admitted that he couldn't stand to look at me because I reminded him of the woman he had supposedly loved the most, my mother. A burning rage exploded inside me, raw and uncontrollable. Before I could stop myself, I screamed at him, my voice shaking with fury and heartbreak. "I wish it had been you who died instead of Mom. She would have never made me feel like this." The second the words left my mouth, I regretted them. But it was too late. My dad's face twisted with rage, and before I could react, he struck me, hard. The force of the slap knocked the breath out of me, leaving my cheek burning with pain. But the physical sting was nothing compared to the devastation I felt inside. My own father, who had never once laid a hand on me before, had just hit me. Tears streamed down my face as I gasped for air, my entire body trembling. I felt broken, shattered, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't live in this house, where my mother's absence loomed like a ghost, where Maddie was erasing her memory piece by piece, and where my father had not only failed me, but hurt me in the worst way possible. I needed to get out. Desperate and lost, I reached out to the only person I thought could help, my Uncle Colin. Colin was my dad's younger brother, the fun uncle, the one who cracked jokes, played games, and made family gatherings bearable. He had always been kind to me, and we had a bond that felt real. When I called him, I wasn't even sure what I was asking for. I had no plan, just an overwhelming need to escape. I poured everything out to him. The disaster with my dad and Maddie, the unbearable pain of watching my mother be erased, and worst of all, the slap. Colin didn't hesitate. He immediately reassured me that I wasn't wrong for feeling the way I did. And then he said the words I didn't know I needed to hear. I'll take care of it. The very next day, he showed up at our house, ready for a confrontation. From upstairs, I could hear the argument as it erupted. Colin was furious, just as disgusted as I had been when he found out about my dad and Maddie. His voice boomed through the house as he accused my dad of dishonoring my mom's memory and failing me as a father. He didn't hold back. He called out every single way my dad had abandoned me, every mistake he had made. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was on my side. But Colin didn't stop there. Apparently, he had also told my paternal grandparents about everything. They had no idea about my dad and Maddie's relationship, and when they found out, they were livid. The phone rang soon after, and I could hear my grandparents berating my father, their voices filled with disappointment and anger. My family was traditional, and the idea of their son being romantically involved with their late daughter-in-law's sister was horrifying to them. Between Colin's fury and the pressure from my grandparents, my dad finally caved. In the end, the decision was made. I would move in with Colin, at least for the time being. My dad barely even looked at me when he told me. His voice was cold, detached, as if I were nothing more than an obligation to him. He informed me, almost emotionlessly, that he would be sending Colin money every month to cover my expenses. That was it. That was all I was to him now, an expense. I was shocked at how quickly everything unfolded, but I didn't care. I knew one thing for certain. Staying with my dad was no longer an option. When Colin turned to me and told me to pack my things, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bags without looking back. And just like that, I walked away from the house that had once been my home, knowing deep down that I would never return. Since the day I left my dad's house, Colin and his girlfriend, Cheryl, have been my family. Years have passed, and living with them has been an entirely different experience, one filled with stability, love, and the kind of care I had been missing for so long. Cheryl is warm and supportive, always making me feel like I belong, something I hadn't felt in my own home for years. My paternal grandparents visit me often, and while they don't speak much about my dad and Maddie, it's clear they disapprove of their relationship. As for my dad, he has been almost entirely absent from my life since I left. At first, he would try to call me, attempt conversations, but when I responded with nothing more than indifference, he eventually gave up. He blamed me for pushing him away, but the truth is, he made his choices, and I made mine. It still stings sometimes, but I've learned to accept it. I've found people who genuinely care about me, and that's what has helped me move forward. Recently, during one of my grandparents' visits, I overheard something that caught me completely off guard. They were whispering about my dad and Maddie, how they had secretly had a baby together. I could tell from the way they spoke that no one in the room was happy about the news. In fact, they sounded disgusted. My dad had apparently kept Maddie's pregnancy hidden from everyone, and now, after the baby was born, he had been desperately trying to reach out to our family, begging them to meet his child. But no one wanted anything to do with him. Not my grandparents, not Colin, no one. Even Maddie's own family, my mom's side, had cut ties with her completely. I hadn't kept in touch with my maternal relatives much since everything happened, but hearing that they had disowned Maddie filled me with a sense of validation I hadn't expected. It reassured me that my mom's memory still mattered, that people saw how wrong Maddie had been for betraying her. Knowing that both sides of my family, paternal and maternal, stood by my mom brought me a quiet sense of satisfaction. At the time, I didn't think much more about their conversation. But imagine my shock when, out of nowhere, my dad called me yesterday. It felt surreal, considering how distant and disconnected we had been for years. His voice was oddly cheerful as he told me how much he missed having me around. That alone caught me off guard. I stayed silent, wary, feeling a sinking sensation in my gut. I knew where this was going. Then he dropped the news. He and Maddie had a baby, and he wanted me to meet my little brother. I couldn't help but scoff. Did he really think introducing me to this child would somehow fix everything between us? That I would suddenly forget everything he had done? I didn't hold back. I told him, flat out, that this baby wasn't my sibling, and that he had no right to call me when he had never cared about me before. That's when he got defensive. He started arguing, trying to guilt-trip me into coming back. He claimed he wanted to put the family back together, that he wanted me to give him another chance to move back home, as if he hadn't spent years proving to me that I was never his priority, as if he hadn't chosen Maddie over me time and time again, as if a baby could somehow erase the pain he had caused. I could hear the desperation in his voice, but it was too late. There was nothing left to fix. At that point, my dad's words meant nothing to me. Where was this concern when I needed him the most? When he and Maddie were pushing me out of my own home, treating me like an unwanted burden. Now that they have a baby, he suddenly wants to play family again, like I'm supposed to just forget everything that happened. It was almost laughable, the way he thought he could erase the past so easily. I shut him down immediately. That's when he accused me of holding a grudge, saying my mom would be disappointed in me for not having any grace. He told me Maddie and my so-called half-sibling deserved a supportive family, and that he was counting on me to do the right thing, as if I owed them anything. Well, I wasn't about to cave to his manipulations, not after everything he had done. Update. To clarify, I'm turning 18 this year, which means my dad has no legal hold over me anymore. I know I'm no longer a dependent kid, but Colin has stepped up as a real parental figure, and he would never let my dad force me to go back. Tonight, I plan on telling Colin about what my dad said, just so he's prepared in case anything happens. I also agree with a lot of what people have pointed out. It's clear my dad only wants me back now because his baby is being treated the same way he treated me after my mom died. Do I feel bad for the baby? Sure. But for him and Maddie? Absolutely not. He's trying to manipulate me into forgiving him. But that's never going to happen. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update, and today my dad showed up unannounced at Colin's house. Colin and Cheryl tried to keep him outside, but he just kept yelling about how he needed to see me. So I finally came downstairs and told him to stop making a scene in front of the neighbors. That's when he started with the guilt tripping again. He claimed he regrets what he did to me and that he wishes I would just come back home now. I stood my ground and told him as firmly as I could that Colin and Cheryl were my family now, and I had no intention of leaving my home. Then he played the victim. He said that ever since I left, his whole family had turned their backs on him and Maddie, and now, even with his baby here, they were still treating him like an outcast. He called me selfish for refusing to see things from his perspective. He insisted that if I just came back home, it would show everyone that we were still a family. I was beyond frustrated at this point. So I finally looked him in the eyes and said, "Dad, I'm done with you. I've been done with you since the day you kicked me out. Since the day I walked in and found you kissing my mom's sister in the kitchen. I want nothing to do with you, Maddie, or your child. You can call me whatever you want, but we will never be family again." I watched as his face fell, the weight of my words sinking in. He looked hurt, like he hadn't expected me to be so direct. But I didn't feel a single ounce of sympathy for him. Not anymore. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Update 3. It's been months since my last update, and I wanted to share some good news. I'm officially 18 now. To clarify a few things, my dad hasn't contacted me since the last time he showed up at Colin's. My family still shuns him, and as far as I know, no one has gone to check on him or his baby. Meanwhile, I'm starting college this year and working part-time, so I no longer need anything from him. Colin and my grandparents have offered to help me financially if I ever need it, and honestly, I feel secure for the first time in a long time. I'm moving forward, and I'm never looking back. Stay tuned for more stories.